What happens when a man who seems to have everything wealth, power, fame, suddenly realizes he has nothing that truly matters? Ethan Caldwell was the kind of name that graced magazine covers and boardroom gossip. A self-made billionaire who only dated models, lived in penthouses, and dined under chandeliers. To the world, he was untouchable, perfect, untouchably perfect. But one broken coffee machine, and one chance encounter with a witty secretary named Claire Bennett began to unravel the polished facade. Could a woman who typed memos in a drafty basement office really pierce the armor of a man the tabloids called the coldest CEO in America? Could ordinary laughter, grocery shopping, and quiet walks through the park hold more power than yachts, galas, and headlines? And when scandal, betrayal, and old fears come crashing in, will Ethan choose the image that made him a fortune, or the love that could cost him everything? This is not just a love story. It's a story about legacy, about courage, and about the extraordinary beauty of an ordinary life. If this journey stirs something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. And now, let's begin. Ethan Caldwell often wondered if silence was supposed to feel this loud. Every night, when the city of Chicago glittered below his penthouse windows, the hum of traffic and the faint wail of distant sirens reached him like echoes from another planet. From the top floor of a glass tower, he looked down on the streets that had once felt like home, but now seemed like a diorama, untouchable, unreal. At 38, Ethan was the kind of man magazines like to turn into myth. Covers announced him as the tech visionary of the Midwest, the reluctant golden bachelor, or the cold prince of Silicon Prairie. His jawline, always perfectly shaved, had been photographed in more glossy spreads than he could remember. He owned cars he rarely drove, a penthouse with ceilings higher than most churches, and a calendar crammed with galas, fundraisers, and product launches. But none of those headlines captured the truth. He wasn't cold by nature. He wasn't heartless. He was, if anything, tired of performing, of inhabiting a character called Ethan Caldwell, while the real man watched from somewhere deep inside, muffled. That evening, as winter pressed itself against the tall windows, Ethan poured himself a glass of bourbon and tried to taste something, anything beyond the sharp burn. The crystal tumbler clinked when he set it down. The sound felt like punctuation in an otherwise empty novel. He had spent the day as he usually did in meetings that stretched across time zones, surrounded by assistants who handled the minutiae of his life. Every decision, from whether to acquire a startup to what tie he should wear on CNBC, passed through the filter of his brand. It was efficient, lucrative, and suffocating. The women he dated, always models, always breathtaking, were another extension of that brand. They smiled for the cameras, played their part at galas, and whispered sweet nothings that sounded suspiciously rehearsed. Ethan had learned long ago not to expect sincerity, but lately, he caught himself staring at their perfect faces and feeling nothing, not even desire. When had his life turned into a well-curated exhibit? He thought about his mother sometimes. Margaret Caldwell had been a high school literature teacher in Evanston, a woman with laugh lines and a stubborn streak. She used to tell him that real stories, were never about wealth or perfection. They were about the cracks, the moments where people stumbled and showed their true selves. Never trust a character who doesn't bleed, she once said over a dinner of meatloaf and green beans. Ethan hadn't bled in years. The bourbon was half gone when his phone buzzed with yet another notification. Something about a partnership announcement his PR team wanted to time with next week's charity gala. He ignored it. For the first time in a long time, he let the thought drift in. What if I just stopped? What if I walked away? But even in his own imagination, the idea seemed impossible. The board would revolt, shareholders would panic, headlines would spin, and Ethan Caldwell, the man, would disappear under the rubble of Ethan Caldwell, the brand. He set the glass aside, rubbing his temples. Maybe that was why he had grown obsessed with the skyline view. It was the only thing that reminded him the world kept moving, with or without him. Down there, People were buying groceries, arguing with spouses, hurrying to catch the train. Ordinary lives, ordinary messes. Messes he hadn't touched since he was 23, and his father's sudden death had thrust him into the CEO chair. A knock at the door startled him. Not many people had access to the penthouse. His housekeeper, Rosa, stepped in, apologetic. "Mr. Caldwell, the coffee machine is broken again," she said, holding up a silver part as evidence. Of course it was. The Italian contraption had cost more than Rosa's annual salary, and yet it sputtered like a dying dragon at the worst moments. Ethan closed his eyes, sighed, and muttered, "Just order another." "She already tried," Rosa replied carefully. "The replacement won't arrive until next week. I'm sorry." For a man who negotiated billion-dollar mergers, the idea of going without his morning espresso felt strangely catastrophic. His assistant was out of town on vacation, his usual backup staff gone for the weekend. That meant one thing: he would have to go out himself. The thought made him almost laugh. Ethan Caldwell, who hadn't set foot in a grocery store in over a decade, who had once joked that he was allergic to fluorescent lighting, would have to hunt down a bag of coffee like an ordinary mortal. The absurdity of it broke something loose inside him. He nodded. "All right, I'll handle it." Rosa blinked, surprised. "You, sir." "Yes." "Rosa, me." After she left, Ethan stood before his closet, scanning rows of tailored suits and polished shoes. None of them seemed suited for the mission at hand. Eventually, he pulled on dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, still expensive, but less like armor. He looked at himself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the man staring back. There was a trace of vulnerability in his eyes, something softer than the corporate glare he had perfected. He thought again of his mother's words: "Stories are about the cracks." Maybe tomorrow, when he stepped into some anonymous store to buy a bag of coffee, a crack would finally appear in his own story. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a flicker of curiosity. Not about profits, not about deals, but about what might happen when a man like him left his glass tower and entered the world of the ordinary. He didn't know it yet, but that errand, the kind of chore most people forgot 5 minutes after doing, was about to change everything. The morning after the coffee machine broke, Ethan Caldwell discovered how unsettling silence could be when it wasn't filled with the smell of espresso. For most people, making coffee was as ordinary as brushing their teeth. For Ethan, it had always been someone else's responsibility. His assistant usually restocked the pantry. Rosa set the machine, and all he had to do was lift a cup. Now, standing in his spotless kitchen with nothing but an empty mug in hand, Ethan realized he had two options: surrender to caffeine withdrawal or step outside his perfectly orchestrated bubble. He chose the second. By 10 o'clock, he was behind the wheel of his black Range Rover, driving through streets he usually only crossed in tinted limousines. The January air bit at the windows, and the city looked grayer than usual, brick buildings stained with age, sidewalks dotted with people bundled in heavy coats. He felt like a tourist in his own town. His destination wasn't a gleaming supermarket or a chic coffee boutique. The navigation app had directed him to a weathered office building on the north side of Chicago. Its ground floor had once housed a bank. Now the facade bore faded lettering that read Lakeview Offices. The reviews online mentioned a small cafe in the basement, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like home. Ethan parked and stepped out, feeling oddly exposed in his designer sweater and polished boots. The building's lobby smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon-scented cleaner. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. It had been years since Ethan walked into a space that didn't scream money. Here, the walls bore scratches, and the elevator wheezed in protest as it carried him down to the basement. The cafe appeared as the doors opened, nestled in a corner. It looked like a secret someone had forgotten to keep. Brick walls, wooden tables scarred with initials, and a chalkboard menu crowded with hand-drawn doodles. The air smelled of freshly ground beans, cinnamon, and something sweet waffles. Maybe. A machine hissed and sputtered behind the counter, filling the room with a steady hum. Ethan hesitated at the entrance, his presence as out of place as a tuxedo at a backyard barbecue. A few people looked up, students with laptops, an older man reading the newspaper, a young mother trying to calm her toddler. They glanced at him, then returned to their worlds. That, more than anything, rattled Ethan. He was used to being recognized instantly. Here, he was just another customer. He approached the counter, where the chalkboard listed options that read like a foreign language macchiato, cortado, nitro cold brew, oat milk latte with lavender syrup. He hadn't ordered coffee for himself since college. His throat tightened. He could negotiate billion-dollar mergers. But this was intimidating. Rough morning. The voice came from his left. A woman, standing a few feet behind him in line, tilted her head with a half smile. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled into a messy bun. Her clothes were practical black slacks, a burgundy blouse slightly wrinkled from hours of wear. A lanyard with an office badge dangled from her neck. She wasn't glamorous in the way Ethan's world defined the word, but there was something arresting about the sharpness in her hazel eyes. Ethan straightened, defensive. "I'm just deciding." The woman arched an eyebrow. "You've been staring at the menu for 3 minutes like it's a tax form?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just amused. Still, no one spoke to him like that. Not anymore. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure whether to feel offended or intrigued. "Do you want me to translate?" she continued, stepping forward as the line moved. "Macchiato means tiny but strong. Cold brew means you'll be jittery for hours. Lavender syrup means someone's trying too hard. Personally, I'd stick with drip. Simple, reliable." Ethan gave a short laugh, surprising himself. Drip, then bold choice. "Mr. Suit," she teased, and moved past him to order her own drink, a black coffee. No cream, no sugar. When Ethan finally reached the counter, he copied her. 1 black coffee. Drip. The barista, a young man with piercings, didn't flinch at his name when he paid. Another reminder in this basement cafe. Ethan Caldwell, tech mogul, was invisible. He carried the steaming cup to a corner table. The chair creaked beneath him, the wood sticky with age. He hadn't sat in such a place since his early 20s, before wealth carved a canyon between him and the rest of the world. He took a sip, burnt, bitter, imperfect, and yet it tasted alive. The woman from earlier sat a table away, opening her laptop with quick, practiced keystrokes. Ethan found himself watching her, not the way he watched models, with detached admiration, but with curiosity. Who was she? This stranger who looked straight through him without hesitation. She caught his gaze and smirked. "What did I spill coffee on myself?" Ethan shook his head. "No, just, you seem familiar." "I doubt it," she replied. "I'm not in magazines." The words landed heavier than she intended. Ethan almost smiled. "That's refreshing." "Claire Bennett," she said after a beat, offering a hand across the space between them. "Secretary, temporary gig upstairs." Ethan hesitated, then took her hand. Her grip was firm, her skin warm. "Ethan," he said simply. No title, no company, just Ethan. Claire tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Ethan, who—" He almost laughed. How long had it been since someone asked that everyone always knew? Everyone always wanted something. But here, in this cafe with brick walls and wobbly tables, he was just a man fumbling for coffee. "Just Ethan," he replied. She studied him for a moment, then leaned back. "All right, just Ethan. Don't look so lost next time. People might start to worry about you." The words, light and teasing, followed him long after he left the cafe. Driving back to his glass tower, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years. Not triumph, not power, but the faintest echo of possibility. Ethan returned to the cafe 2 mornings later, though he told himself it was simply because Rosa hadn't yet figured out how to replace the broken machine. The truth was harder to admit that something about the woman with the sharp eyes and sharper tongue lingered in his mind. The basement cafe looked exactly as it had before, brick walls damp with age, the hiss of the espresso machine, a faint trace of maple syrup in the air. The tables were half filled with people who looked as though they had nowhere else to be, laptops glowing, books spread open. Ethan joined the short line, tugging at his coat as though that might make him blend in. The chalkboard menu still mocked him with its endless options: cappuccino, cortado, oat milk latte, caramel swirl, macchiato. He stared at the choices until the words blurred. Why does coffee have to be complicated, he thought, a bead of irritation forming behind his temples. Back again, the voice came from directly behind him, warm, teasing, and unmistakably familiar. Ethan turned. There she was, Claire Bennett, the secretary with the unshakable smirk. She had swapped her burgundy blouse for a navy cardigan, her hair pulled up in a neater bun, though a rebellious strand fell against her cheek. She carried herself with an energy that seemed both weary and irrepressible, like someone who'd been up late working but still refused to surrender to fatigue. I thought you might have sworn off this place after the trauma of ordering coffee, Claire continued. Ethan bristled, though his lips twitched despite himself. I don't remember it being that dramatic. You looked like you were solving a calculus problem. He glanced back at the chalkboard. Well, it reads like one. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Pro tip. The fancier the name, the more likely it tastes like dessert pretending to be coffee. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan muttered. Still lost? She pressed. He cleared his throat. I was considering the cortado. Claire tilted her head. Do you even know what that is? Ethan hesitated. He hated admitting ignorance, but he had no choice. Not exactly. Her grin widened. Half espresso, half milk. Basically, training wheels for adults who want to feel sophisticated without committing. He almost laughed, almost. Then maybe not. How about a macchiato? He asked, scanning the board again. Tiny shot drowned in foam. You'll still be hungry for real coffee. Ethan sighed. Fine. What do you drink black? She replied without hesitation. Like life. No frills. It was such an unvarnished answer that Ethan couldn't help but admire it. In his world, people rarely said what they meant. They layered every word with calculation. Claire, on the other hand, tossed hers out like pebbles in a pond, not caring where they landed. The line moved forward. Ethan reached the counter and, almost defiantly, said, 1 black coffee. The barista nodded, barely paying attention. Claire, standing behind him, let out a small, victorious laugh. Look at you, a fast learner. When Ethan stepped aside to wait for his drink, Claire ordered her own and then joined him near the end of the counter. So, she began, crossing her arms. What's your deal? My deal? Yeah, guys in cashmere sweaters don't usually haunt basement coffee shops, especially not 2 days in a row. What's the story? Ethan hesitated. He could offer her the polished script he gave interviewers, something about supporting local businesses or escaping routine. But for reasons he couldn't name, he found himself speaking more honestly. My machine broke, he admitted. Claire blinked, then let out a laugh so sudden a few people turned their heads. That's it. The mighty machine failed, and now you're among us commoners. The words might have stung if not for the twinkle in her eye. She wasn't mocking to wound, she was mocking to test. Ethan lifted his cup as the barista set it down. Apparently, Claire grabbed her own and followed him to a nearby table. She sat without invitation, resting her elbows on the scarred wood. So, you're telling me you couldn't survive without caffeine for a day, and instead of sending someone else, you actually came here. Ethan took a sip of the bitter brew. Something like that? Her expression softened, curiosity flickering behind the humor. Interesting. It struck him then how rare it was for anyone to find him interesting, without already knowing who he was. Usually, curiosity about Ethan Caldwell was tied to his money, his company, his status. With Claire, it seemed tied to the fact that he looked like a man out of his element. He didn't know whether to feel insulted or relieved. They sat for a few minutes, exchanging small remarks. Claire spoke about the office upstairs, a law firm that had hired her temporarily. She joked about how half her job was fixing the printer, and the other half was reminding the partners of their own deadlines. Ethan found himself listening, really listening, in a way he hadn't with anyone in years. At one point, Claire leaned back and studied him. "You're not from around here, are you?" Ethan raised a brow. "Chicago born and raised. No, I mean here. This world. Basement cafes, creaky chairs, people buying coffee with wrinkled dollar bills. You look like you belong in, I don't know, a magazine ad." He opened his mouth to protest, but stopped. She wasn't wrong. His world was penthouses and boardrooms, not chipped mugs and chalkboard menus. For reasons he couldn't explain, that realization made his chest ache. Claire seemed to sense it, because she leaned forward and added, more gently, "Relax. It's not an insult. It's just, you stand out, that's all." Her words were disarming in their simplicity. Ethan sipped his coffee, feeling the heat travel down his throat, grounding him. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him without agenda. As he left the cafe that morning, Claire's parting words echoed in his mind. "Don't look so lost next time." He realized with a start that she had managed something extraordinary. She had made him feel seen, not as a symbol, not as a CEO, but as a man who didn't quite know what to order. And strangely, he didn't mind. Ethan told himself he had business in the neighborhood. That was the excuse. Anyway, the story he rehearsed each time he steered his Range Rover toward the weathered Lakeview building. A meeting with a potential partner, a walkthrough for possible office expansion. Something respectable, something rational. But the truth was simpler. Almost embarrassing, he wanted another cup of that bitter black coffee. Or maybe it wasn't the coffee at all. The cafe had begun to pull at him the way gravity pulls at a stone. It was a strange little place. No glossy marble counters, no baristas trained to chirp brand slogans. Instead, chipped mugs clinked against wood, the hum of conversation mixed with the steady hiss of steam. Every time Ethan stepped inside, he felt the noise of his usual world fall away, the endless emails, the board's demands, the flash of cameras. And then there was Claire. She didn't always notice him. Sometimes she sat at a corner table with her laptop open, typing so furiously her fingers seemed to blur. A legal pad sat beside her, covered in quick shorthand notes. Her coffee cup refilled more often than seemed humanly possible. Other times, she carried folders upstairs to the law firm, her stride brisk, her blouse rumpled but her posture unshaken. She wasn't flawless. That, oddly enough, was what unsettled him most. One afternoon, he caught himself watching as she wrestled with the office printer, muttering under her breath when it jammed for the third time. She smacked the side of the machine with a sharp thud, then laughed to herself as though surrendering to the absurdity of it all. Ethan, who usually had assistants to handle technical annoyances before he even noticed them, felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Amusement, yes, but also admiration. Claire handled chaos with a shrug and a joke. Ethan handled chaos with a team of advisors and a multi-step crisis plan. The contrast was magnetic. He tried, awkwardly, to start conversations when their paths crossed. Once, he asked if she'd ever considered working for a larger firm. Claire arched an eyebrow and said, "What? So I can sit in prettier chairs while fixing the same broken printers." Another time, he offered to buy her coffee, only for her to wave him off. "Thanks, but I make my own mistakes." Her deflection stung in ways Ethan didn't expect. Women rarely brushed him aside. Most leaned in, eager to claim a piece of his orbit. Claire, however, seemed immune. That immunity made him restless, late at night, in his penthouse high above the city. Ethan replayed those brief encounters in his head. The way her lips quirked when she teased him, the spark in her hazel eyes when she challenged his every assumption, the way she didn't soften her words just because he was who he was. It wasn't infatuation, not in the shallow, fleeting sense he knew too well. It was something heavier, quieter. Still, he resisted the idea. You're a CEO, he reminded himself. You don't chase after secretaries in basement cafes. You have a company to run, an image to maintain. But that argument felt weaker each day, because the truth was, Ethan had grown exhausted with being only a CEO, with being only an image, and every time Claire looked at him, looked through him, really he glimpsed the possibility of being something else, someone else. The thought frightened him. One morning, he lingered longer than usual at the cafe. Claire sat 2 tables away, hair loose around her shoulders for once, her cardigan slipping off one arm. She was typing, pausing only to sip her coffee, her brow furrowed in concentration. A ray of winter sunlight filtered through the narrow basement window, catching on her profile. For reasons Ethan couldn't explain, the sight settled him. There she was, living an ordinary moment, typing, sipping, frowning, pushing her hair back with the back of her hand. And there he was, watching, feeling a calmness he hadn't felt in years. It struck him with force the boardroom never gave him this peace. The luxury penthouse never gave him this warmth. Only here, in this imperfect cafe, with this imperfect woman, did he feel something real? That realization unnerved him. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair, and carried his half-finished coffee to the trash. As he pushed through the cafe doors into the biting wind, he muttered under his breath, "Get a grip. Caldwell." But even as he walked back to his car, the truth echoed louder than the traffic. He didn't want a grip. He wanted to let go. The war inside him had begun between the polished CEO the world expected and the man who longed for the ordinary, the authentic, the unguarded. And whether he liked it or not, Claire Bennett was at the center of that war. By the end of the week, Ethan could no longer ignore the pull. He had stopped by the cafe every day, always finding some excuse he needed to clear his head before a meeting. He was scouting properties in the neighborhood. He just happened to be driving by. But the truth was simpler. He wanted to see Claire. It wasn't just the banter, though her quick wit had a way of disarming him. It wasn't just the coffee, though he had started to prefer the bitter, burnt flavor over the sterile perfection of his old machine. It was something about the way she occupied her space, unapologetic and unpolished, as if she had nothing to prove. On Friday afternoon, after a particularly brutal board call that left him drained, Ethan decided to take a leap. He walked into the cafe, found Claire hunched over her laptop, and cleared his throat. She looked up, eyes narrowing. Back again. "Either you're addicted to this place or you're stalking me. Maybe both," Ethan said before he could stop himself. To his relief, she smirked. He sat down across from her without asking. "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner tonight." Her fingers paused over the keyboard. Dinner. Yes. A restaurant, I know. Quiet. Good food. Claire leaned back, crossing her arms. "Let me guess. White tablecloths, waiters in tuxedos. Wine lists longer than my lease agreement." Ethan hesitated. Something like that. Her smirk hardened into something sharper. "I'm not one of your models. Mr. Caldwell." The words landed like a slap. Ethan blinked, stunned. "Excuse me. You know," she said, voice steady, "the kind who show up on your arm at fundraisers. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect ability to laugh at your jokes. I've seen the magazines. I'm not interested in auditioning for that role." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. He wasn't used to rejection, not in business, not in relationships. Women didn't say no to him. They said yes with eagerness, with calculation, sometimes with desperation. But Claire had said no with ease, as though she had nothing to lose. He felt heat rising in his chest, not anger exactly, but something raw humiliation mingled with curiosity. "Claire," he said finally, lowering his voice. "That's not what this is? Then what is it?" she shot back. Ethan searched for an answer. Something honest, something that didn't sound like a line, but all he managed was, "I just thought we could talk." Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "We're talking now." The conversation ended there. She returned to her laptop, fingers flying across the keys as though the matter was settled. Ethan sat frozen for a moment, then stood, leaving his coffee untouched. That night, back in his penthouse, Ethan poured himself bourbon and let the rejection replay in his mind. "I'm not one of your models, Mr. Caldwell?" The sentence gnawed at him. Was that truly how the world saw him? A man who collected women the way he collected properties and cars. A man defined not by who he was, but by who stood next to him in photographs. Maybe Claire was right. He sat in the dim light of his living room, staring out at the sprawl of Chicago's skyline. For the first time in years, he felt small inside his own home. His thoughts drifted back to Evanston, to a much smaller house with peeling paint and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of onions and soap. His mother, Margaret, had taught high school English by day and tutored neighborhood kids by night. She never cared about appearances. She cared about truth, about kindness, about doing the right thing even when it was hard. Ethan remembered one night when he was 10. Money had been tight, his father's business struggling, his mother's salary barely covering groceries. Still, Margaret had invited one of her students to dinner, a boy whose family couldn't afford much. Ethan had asked why, when they didn't have enough themselves. His mother had smiled and said, "Because stories only matter when they're shared, and meals are stories too." That evening, they'd eaten meatloaf and mashed potatoes, served on mismatched plates, and Ethan had laughed harder than he could remember. Now, sitting alone with bourbon and silence, he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal that meant something. He thought of Claire again, her sharp tongue, her laughter, the way she seemed unimpressed by him. Maybe that was why he wanted dinner with her. Not for show, not for photographs, but because he craved the kind of conversation that didn't need polish. But Claire had seen through him. She'd seen the image he'd spent years cultivating and refused to play along. And deep down, Ethan knew she was right. He drained the last of his bourbon and set the glass down hard. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt exposed. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. The Gala was everything Ethan's life had been built upon, chandeliers blazing with light, champagne glasses tinkling like tiny bells, men in tailored suits shaking hands with the precision of a choreographed dance. He had attended dozens of such events, his smile as rehearsed as his speeches, his presence a guarantee of media attention. Tonight was no different. Cameras flashed as he stepped into the grand ballroom of the Palmer House, the marble columns gleaming, the air thick with perfume and ambition. Ethan slipped easily into the role he knew so well. Ethan Caldwell, billionaire tech visionary, patron of the arts, the man whose words could sway investors with a single sentence. But then, across the crowded room, he saw her, Claire Bennett. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, the woman by the far wall, holding a simple glass of water and looking both fascinated and faintly uncomfortable, was unmistakably her. Her dress was navy blue, modest compared to the sequined gowns that glittered all around her. Her hair was pinned loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She wasn't adorned in diamonds, but something about her gaze, clear, honest, unflinching, made her stand out more than anyone else in the room. Ethan felt his breath hitch. What on earth is she doing here? He excused himself from a cluster of investors and crossed the room. Claire noticed him when he was halfway there, her eyebrows lifting in something between surprise and challenge. "Well," she said when he reached her, "Mr. Caldwell? Imagine finding you here." Ethan blinked. "I could say the same. My boss was invited," she explained, "one of the partners at the firm. He had a last-minute conflict and told me to fill in. Something about taking notes during the speeches. I'm guessing he didn't expect the CEO of Caldwell Technologies to be on stage tonight." Her tone was light, but her eyes carried that familiar spark, the one that cut right through him. Before Ethan could respond, a photographer swooped in. "Mr. Caldwell, over here, smile." The flash went off, capturing not only Ethan's polished expression, but Claire beside him, her glass raised as if in ironic salute. Within minutes, whispers began. Who was she? Not a model, not a socialite, someone new. Ethan felt the shift immediately, the subtle glances, the murmured speculations. He was used to being the subject of gossip, but this was different. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control of the narrative. Still, he tried. When the evening speeches began, Ethan was ushered to the stage. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his features, and delivered the lines he had rehearsed about innovation, about responsibility, about the bright future his company was building. The crowd responded with polite applause. Cameras clicked. Ethan's smile stayed steady. But then, from the corner of his eye, he caught sight of Claire. She was shaking her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Not cruel, not mocking, just unimpressed. It rattled him. After the speech, he found her again near the refreshment table. "Enjoy the performance," he asked, his voice tighter than he intended. Claire didn't look up from her glass. Oh, it was flawless. Every word polished, every gesture calculated, the perfect businessman. Ethan bristled. "That's my job." She finally met his eyes. "Is it, or is it just your mask?" The question cut deeper than he expected. Around them, glittering guests laughed and mingled, oblivious. But to Ethan, the room seemed to narrow until there was only her voice. "You should have seen yourself up there," Claire continued, softer now, like an actor in a role you've played so long you forgot your own lines. Ethan felt heat climb his neck. No one spoke to him this way, not in public, not in private. And yet, instead of pushing back, he found himself searching her face for something he couldn't name. She set down her glass. "Relax. Caldwell, I'm not trying to humiliate you. I'm just saying, maybe the man who drinks bitter drip coffee in a basement cafe is more interesting than the one giving speeches under chandeliers." Then she turned, slipping into the crowd before he could reply. Ethan stood frozen, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar mix of emotions, shame, frustration, and an ache he couldn't quite identify. Because the truth was, Claire had seen something no one else dared to, and she wasn't wrong. The cameras kept flashing, the music kept playing, the donors kept smiling, but Ethan Caldwell, for the first time in his carefully managed life, felt like a fraud in his own world. The Monday after the gala, Ethan arrived at his company headquarters earlier than usual. Normally, his schedule was tightly choreographed. He swept in mid-morning, headed straight to the executive floor, and shut himself off in meetings that revolved around stock performance and global strategy. But that morning, he bypassed the private elevator that led directly to the top and instead stepped onto the main floor, where rows of cubicles buzzed with activity. At first, no one noticed. Then whispers spread. By the time Ethan sat down in an empty chair near the intern's corner, the entire floor seemed to hold its breath. "Morning," he said simply, pulling a paper cup of burnt breakroom coffee closer. A few nervous laughs rippled. One of the junior analysts stammered a greeting. Another offered him a bagel from the box her team had shared. Ethan accepted, breaking off a piece with deliberate slowness. It was clumsy, awkward, but intentional. For the first time in years, Ethan was stepping outside the protective glass bubble of wealth and power he had built around himself. Over the next days, the shift continued. He ate lunch in the cafeteria instead of his private dining room. He asked employees about their weekends and listened to their answers instead of nodding distractedly. He lingered by desks, curious about the projects that usually never reached his level. And people noticed. Some were skeptical, others cautiously optimistic. "What's gotten into Caldwell?" one engineer whispered. "Midlife crisis." But for Ethan, it wasn't a performance. Something about Claire's words at the gala mask, actor, role, had pierced deeper than he cared to admit. He couldn't stop hearing them, echoing against the hollow chambers of his life. If he wanted to prove her wrong, he had to begin here, among his own people. Claire, meanwhile, was less easily convinced. She had seen him at his most polished, dazzling a ballroom with empty words. And she had seen him stumble through ordering coffee, stripped of certainty. Which version was real? On Wednesday afternoon, She found herself back in the basement cafe, laptop open, typing furiously. She looked up when a shadow fell across her table. Ethan. He carried his own coffee, no assistant in sight, and slid into the chair opposite her. "May I?" "You already did," Claire replied, closing her laptop halfway. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the espresso machine. Then Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "I want you to know something. I'm trying." Claire arched a brow. "Trying what?" "To perfect the act." His jaw tightened. "To be real." She gave a short, skeptical laugh. "And how's that going? Between ribbon cuttings and glossy magazine spreads." "Not as well as I'd like," he admitted, surprising her. "But I'm making changes." Claire studied him, unsure whether to believe him. "Changes I've been spending time with the staff, not just the executives, the people who actually keep the place running." She tilted her head. "And what's that like? Mingling with the mortals instead of bristling." Ethan smiled faintly. "Humbling, eye-opening, and lonelier than I expected." The last word slipped out before he could stop it. Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Lonely," she repeated. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of rare vulnerability. "Do you know what it's like to be in a room full of people, cameras flashing, everyone laughing, and feel like none of them would notice if you disappeared?" Claire hesitated. She hadn't expected honesty. She had expected charm, bravado, maybe a clever deflection, but there was something raw in his voice, something that tugged at her despite herself. Still, she crossed her arms. A protective barrier. "You're telling me the man with a penthouse view and a fleet of cars is lonely?" "Yes." The word landed with quiet certainty. No theatrics, no pleading, just truth. For a long moment, Claire said nothing. Her instinct was to roll her eyes, to dismiss it as another performance. But deep down, a small part of her believed him. She had seen glimpses the way he lingered in the cafe, the way he watched without speaking, the way his mask seemed to crack when he thought no one was looking. And yet, belief came with danger. So, she set her jaw. "Maybe you are lonely, but loneliness doesn't excuse everything. It doesn't erase the way you've built walls so high no one can see who you are." Ethan nodded slowly, as though her words were not an attack, but an affirmation of something he already knew. "That's why I'm here," he said quietly. "Because when you look at me, you don't see the walls. You see me, and I don't even know how to handle that." The cafe noise seemed to fade, leaving only the weight of his confession between them. Claire looked down at her coffee, fingers tightening around the cup. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself lean into the possibility that maybe this man, flawed and complicated, was telling the truth. But belief came with risk, and risk, for her, was dangerous. So, she took a sip, forcing a wry smile. "Well, at least you're self-aware. That's more than I can say for most men in suits." Ethan chuckled softly, though his eyes searched hers with something close to pleading. For now, Claire kept her guard up, but a crack had formed a hairline fracture in her certainty. And Ethan, for the first time in years, felt a crack in his armor too. It began with a flash. One Friday evening, Ethan and Claire left the cafe together. It wasn't a date, not really. They had lingered after closing time, Claire finishing paperwork while Ethan drank yet another black coffee. When they finally walked out into the crisp night air, their laughter carried down the street. That's when the photographers struck. Neither of them noticed at first the glint of a lens across the road, the muffled click of shutters. But the next morning, Ethan woke to chaos. Across half a dozen news sites, his face stared back at him. Claire stood beside him in every frame, her expression caught mid-laugh, her hand brushing his sleeve. The caption screamed, "Billionaire's new secretary, romance from boardroom to basement cafe, who is Claire Bennett." By noon, his PR team had flooded his phone with urgent texts. Damage control, one message read, another bluntly, "Do we confirm or deny?" But Ethan wasn't thinking about investors or headlines. He was thinking about Claire. He found her at the cafe that afternoon. She was already there, arms crossed, the morning's newspaper folded on the table like evidence in a trial. "Don't," she said when he opened his mouth. "Don't you dare tell me this is nothing." Ethan froze. "Claire." She pushed the paper toward him. The front page showed them side by side. The photo cropped to make them look like a couple stepping out of a romantic dinner. "They've turned me into a punchline," she snapped, a secretary sleeping her way up the ladder. "Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Ethan sank into the chair across from her. "I didn't plan this. You didn't have to plan it. It follows you everywhere: your money, your cars, your shiny speeches. And now me, I didn't sign up to be some gossip column's flavor of the week." Her voice rose, heads turning from nearby tables. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his tone. "Claire, please, listen to me. No, you listen." Her eyes blazed. "You stroll into my world, with your tailored suits and your practiced smile, and suddenly I'm a prop, a symbol. The ordinary woman who caught the billionaire's eye. Do you know how insulting that is?" Ethan's chest tightened. "That's not how I see you." "Then how do you see me?" she demanded. "Be honest." He faltered. Words, once his greatest weapon, abandoned him. All he could manage was different. Claire let out a sharp laugh, bitter and short. "Different. That's convenient. Makes me sound special enough to justify the headlines without you actually saying anything real. That's not fair," Ethan said quietly. "Fair," she repeated, her voice shaking now, not just with anger, but with hurt. "I've worked for everything I have. I've fought for every inch of respect. And in one photograph, one headline, it's gone. People will assume I'm just another accessory to your image, another model in a long line. And maybe that's all I am to you." Her words landed like blows. Ethan flinched, because deep down, he feared she might be right. "I never wanted this for you," he said finally. "But it happened," she shot back. "And the worst part? You'll survive it. You always do. But me," she pointed to the paper, "I'm the one who has to walk into an office on Monday with people whispering behind my back. I'm the one whose name is dragged through mud for something I never asked for." Silence pressed between them. Claire's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. Ethan stared at the table, the bitter truth ringing in his ears. She was right. He had lived his life with Shield's wealth, reputation, power. Scandals bounced off him like rain against glass. But Claire had no such armor. By letting her into his orbit, even unintentionally, he had exposed her to the storm that followed him everywhere. And, unless he proved otherwise, she would always be right to think he was selfish. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. Claire's lips parted, but her eyes stayed hard. "Then figure out who you are." "Ethan. Because right now, all I see is a man who says he wants truth, but still hides behind a spotlight." She stood, gathering her bag. For a moment, Ethan thought she might glance back, soften her words. But she walked out without another look, leaving him alone at the table with the newspaper headline staring up at him like a taunt. Ethan pressed a hand to his chest, where a dull ache spread beneath his ribs. For years, he had thought success meant never being vulnerable, never needing anyone. Now, as the cafe door closed behind Claire, he realized vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the only way he might not lose her, but unless he found the courage to prove it, Claire Bennett was gone. The storm rolled into Chicago just after dusk, thunder cracking above the skyline as sheets of rain blurred the city lights. By the time Ethan left his office, the streets were slick with water, headlights slicing through the downpour. He didn't care about the weather. All he cared about was finding Claire. The tabloids hadn't let up all week. Headlines multiplied like weeds. Mystery secretary still linked to Caldwell. Office romance or PR stunt. Each story twisted the truth further, painting Claire as either opportunist or victim. Ethan knew every word cut her deeper, and he hadn't done nearly enough to protect her. So, that night, he drove across the city, windshield wipers straining, his chest heavy with urgency. He found her outside the Lakeview building, clutching an umbrella that the wind had already turned inside out. She was leaving late, folders pressed to her chest, hair damp against her face. The rain fell so hard it bounced off the sidewalk in tiny explosions. Claire. She spun around, startled. Her eyes widened when she saw him, standing there in the storm without even a coat, rain soaking through his shirt. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted over the roar of traffic. "You'll catch pneumonia. I needed to see you." Ethan called back, stepping closer until they stood beneath the same broken umbrella. Water dripped down their shoulders, pooling at their feet. Claire's jaw tightened. "Ethan, not now. I've had a long day. I don't care about the tabloids," he said, his voice rough with urgency. "I don't care about the image. I don't want that. I want you." Her breath caught. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, the sound of rain dulling under the weight of his words. But then she shook her head. "Words are easy. Ethan, you of all people should know that. You've built an empire on them." The accusation stung, but she wasn't wrong. He took another step, close enough to see the rain sliding down her lashes. "This isn't a speech. This isn't for anyone else. I'm telling you because it's the only truth I know right now." Claire's grip on her folders tightened. She looked at him, really looked, and something flickered in her eyes, longing, maybe, or belief fighting against doubt. But she pulled back, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "Then prove it." Ethan froze. "How?" "That's not my job to tell you," she replied, her tone sharp but laced with hurt. "If you really want me, if you really mean what you say, then you'll figure it out. Not with grand gestures, not with magazine covers, but with change. Real change." The wind gusted, ripping the umbrella from her hands. It skittered down the street like a broken bird, leaving them fully exposed to the downpour. Claire didn't chase it. She simply turned, clutching her folders tighter, and walked toward the train station. Ethan stood rooted to the sidewalk, rainwater running down his face, mixing with the salt of regret. He could have chased her, could have begged her to stay, could have promised the world at her feet, but Claire had made it clear the words weren't enough. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell believed her. He drove home in silence, the storm still raging outside. His penthouse, usually a refuge of order and control, felt cavernous and empty. The rain battered the glass windows, echoing the turbulence inside him. "Words are easy." Claire's voice replayed in his head like a verdict. She was right. He had lived behind polished phrases and perfect optics for so long that even his truth sounded rehearsed. If he wanted her, if he wanted anything real, he couldn't just say it. He had to be it. For years, he had believed that power came from control. Now, drenched and hollow, he understood the only way to have Claire, the only way to deserve her, was to let go of control, not to play the role of the perfect businessman, not to craft another speech, but to change, quietly, deeply, permanently, because anything less would mean losing her forever. Ethan set his soaked jacket on the floor and sat heavily on the couch, water dripping from his hair. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time in decades, he felt something shift. He had confessed, he had been rejected, and yet, beneath the ache of failure, a strange clarity burned. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the only fight worth having. It was late on a Saturday when Ethan finally allowed himself to peel back the curtain of his own history. He and Claire sat in the quiet corner of the cafe after hours. The lights dimmed, the hum of the espresso machine silenced. Claire had agreed to meet, reluctantly, her guard still firmly in place after the storm outside her office days before. But something in Ethan's eyes, tired, unpolished, had convinced her to listen. For a while, they sat in silence, sipping lukewarm coffee. Then Ethan spoke. "My father died when I was 23. Claire looked up, startled by the suddenness of the admission. Ethan stared at the table, tracing the rim of his mug with his thumb. He had a heart attack. No warning. One day he was there, lecturing me about responsibility, about earning respect, and the next, He was gone. Just like that. His voice was flat, but his hand trembled slightly. I was in graduate school, studying economics. My plan was simple work for a bank, maybe travel, live a normal life. But when he died, the company had no one else. The board made it clear either I stepped in or everything he built would collapse. Claire leaned back, her expression softening despite herself. "So, you did it," she murmured. "I did it," Ethan confirmed. I walked into a boardroom where half the men were old enough to be my grandfather. I was barely shaving, and they expected me to lead them. "Do you know how I survived?" He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time she saw not arrogance, but fragility. "I became cold," he admitted. "I learned to smile only when necessary, to speak with certainty even when I was drowning in doubt. I studied their weaknesses, their tells, until I could predict every move. I built a wall around myself so high no one could see how terrified I was." His words lingered, heavy in the air. Claire said nothing, afraid to break the thread he had finally dared to unravel. Over time, Ethan continued. The wall became my identity. The cold businessman, the man who doesn't flinch, doesn't fail, doesn't feel, and it worked. The company grew. The world believed the mask. Hell, sometimes even I believed it. He exhaled, the sound closer to a sigh than a breath. But underneath, I was still that kid who lost his father too soon. A boy pretending to be a man while everyone watched. For a moment, the cafe seemed to shrink around them. Claire's chest tightened as she studied him. This man who had always appeared untouchable, suddenly stripped down to bone and truth. "You've carried that alone all these years?" she asked softly. Ethan gave a small, humorless smile. "Who else was going to carry it? My mother did her best, but she was grieving. The board didn't want a grieving son. They wanted a figurehead they could mold. And the media? They wanted a story. Young CEO steps in." They never asked how it felt. Claire's throat ached. She thought of the headlines, the polished photos, the glittering galas. She had always assumed he thrived on it, that he craved the spotlight. But now, hearing him speak, she realized the spotlight had been a prison, one he had locked himself inside to survive. "You were just a kid," she whispered. "Yes," he said, "and I never had the chance to stop being one." Silence stretched again, but it was different this time. Not sharp, not hostile, simply heavy with unspoken understanding. Claire wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, grounding herself. She had promised herself she wouldn't fall for charm, for appearances, for empty words. But this wasn't empty. This was raw, and it unsettled her. "You know what I see right now?" she said finally. Ethan's brow furrowed. What a man who's spent 15 years convincing the world he doesn't bleed. But here you are, proving that you do. The words caught him off guard. For a moment, his composure cracked further, and she saw something in his eyes that looked dangerously close to relief. "Does that make me weak?" he asked quietly. Claire shook her head. "No, it makes you human, which is a lot harder. Sometimes." For the first time in their strange, jagged journey, Ethan allowed himself to lean back without the weight of his mask pressing down, and Claire, though still cautious, found herself looking at him not as a billionaire or a headline, but as a man who had been forced to grow up too fast and never quite stopped pretending. Neither of them said much more that night, but as they left the cafe, walking side by side under the pale glow of street lamps, Claire knew something had shifted. She didn't trust him completely, not yet, but she had seen his weakness, his truth, and once you see the cracks in someone's armor, it's hard to forget they're there. It started with something as simple as a grocery list. Claire had been rattling off the items she needed: milk, eggs, bread, fresh spinach, when Ethan, standing in the doorway of her small office, surprised her with a quiet declaration. "Let me come with you." She blinked. "To the grocery store?" "Yes," he said, unflinching. "I've closed billion-dollar deals. I think I can handle a shopping cart." Claire raised a skeptical brow. "You'll last 10 minutes before fleeing to your penthouse. Then I'll prove you wrong." The store was bustling that Saturday afternoon, carts squeaking, kids begging for cereal with cartoon mascots, the scent of rotisserie chicken drifting through the aisles. Claire moved with ease, weaving through the chaos, tossing produce into her basket. Ethan followed behind with a cart, looking oddly out of place in his tailored coat and polished shoes. At first, he seemed lost, scanning the rows of canned goods like a man dropped into a foreign country without a map. But then Claire pressed a box of pasta into his hands. "Put this in, and don't look so terrified. It's just food." Ethan managed a small smile, dropping the box into the cart. "My mother used to bring me shopping every Saturday," he said, almost absently. "She'd make it a lesson. We'd calculate prices per ounce, compare labels. She said it was how I'd learn the value of $1. Claire glanced at him, caught off guard by the softness in his voice. "Sounds like she was smart." "She was," he replied, his eyes distant for a moment. "After she died, I stopped going. Haven't stepped foot in one of these places in years." They moved through the store in a rhythm that felt strangely natural, Claire tossing in vegetables, Ethan dutifully adding them to the cart, occasionally questioning why they needed 3 different spices for one recipe. By the time they reached the checkout, Ethan looked less like a billionaire and more like any other man trying to remember if he'd forgotten the milk. Later, at Claire's small apartment, they cooked together. The kitchen was modest, the counters cluttered with mismatched mugs and recipe cards stained with use. Ethan rolled up his sleeves and clumsily chopped onions under Claire's amused gaze. "You're holding the knife like it's a fountain pen," she teased. "And yet," he said, pointing to the uneven pile, "the onions are still chopped." "Barely," she countered, laughing as she slid the pieces into a sizzling pan. The scent of garlic and olive oil filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of a neighbor's radio through the walls. Ethan stirred the sauce while Claire boiled pasta, and for a fleeting moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the sterile quiet of his penthouse, not the staged elegance of gala dinners, just the warmth of a tiny kitchen, the clatter of pans, the sound of Claire humming under her breath. It reminded him of home, of his mother's hands dusted with flour, of her laughter when he spilled sugar across the counter. He found himself smiling, not the practiced curve of lips he wore for photographers, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. After dinner, they took a walk through the park nearby. The evening air was crisp, the leaves rustling above them, street lamps casting long shadows on the path. Families strolled with strollers, couples jogged past, dogs tugged at their leashes. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets, watching Claire as she described her favorite routes: the bakery that sold the best scones, the elderly man who always fed the pigeons near the fountain. "You really know this place," he said. "It's my world," she replied simply. "It's not glamorous, but it's real." They stopped near a bench, the glow of the lamppost illuminating her face. Claire brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her breath visible in the cool air. Ethan's chest tightened. He reached for her hand, tentative, as if asking permission. She didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and for a suspended moment, the world seemed to fade: the rustling leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of traffic. Ethan leaned closer, his heart hammering, his breath mingling with hers. But just as their lips nearly touched, Claire stepped back, breaking the fragile spell. "I can't," she whispered, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying turmoil. Ethan swallowed hard, masking his disappointment. "Why not?" "Because I don't know if this is real," she said, pulling her coat tighter around her. "I can't be just another experiment in your search for whatever it is you're looking for." Her words cut, but he didn't argue. He only nodded, understanding that trust wasn't built in a single night of groceries and pasta. As they walked back, a quiet settled between them. Not the cold silence of rejection, but the fragile silence of something unfinished, waiting. Ethan glanced at her, memorizing the way her hair caught the lamplight, the way her steps were steady even when her heart was guarded. For the first time, he wasn't frustrated by her hesitation. For the first time, He realized he was willing to wait. The headline screamed across every glossy magazine cover at the airport kiosks, Caldwell back in the arms of supermodel Serena. Lane Claire froze when she saw it on her way to work. The photo showed Ethan at a hotel entrance in New York, Serena's hand brushing his arm as they walked side by side. The image was perfectly timed, ambiguous enough to ignite scandal, damning enough to crush trust. Her chest constricted. She'd spent weeks allowing herself to believe Ethan was different, that he wanted something beyond appearances. And yet, here was proof, or at least the appearance of proof, that she had been foolish to think she wasn't just another fleeting distraction. She walked into the office stiffly, ignoring the knowing looks from coworkers who had seen the same headline. Lucy from accounting whispered to another colleague, loud enough for Claire to hear, "Guess the secretary fairy tale didn't last long." Claire sat at her desk, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. Her phone buzzed with messages, friends asking if the story was true, if she was okay. She didn't reply. By noon, she had made her decision. Whatever they had, whatever they might have had, it was over. When Ethan returned to Chicago that evening, he found Claire waiting in the lobby of his building. Her face was pale, her voice sharp. "Don't bother explaining. I saw the photos." Claire. She raised a hand to stop him. "I told myself I wouldn't be the fool. I wouldn't be the woman who believed a billionaire when he said he wanted something real. But here I am." Her words hit him harder than any boardroom ambush. "It's not what it looks like," he said, his voice raw. "Serena cornered me after a meeting. She wanted to discuss a campaign, nothing more. I didn't invite her. I didn't. Does it matter?" Claire cut in, her voice breaking. "The world believes it. And you thrive in that world." The pain in her eyes was worse than any headline. Before he could say more, she turned and walked away, leaving him in the marble lobby, stunned and hollow. That night, Ethan sat in his office with the magazine spread open before him. The photo glared back at him like an accusation. His legal team called it a nuisance. His PR manager suggested issuing a polished denial and letting the story fade. Damage control, they called it. But Ethan's fists clenched. For the first time, the thought of damage control sickened him. Because this wasn't about his reputation, it was about Claire, about the way her face had closed off, the way her voice had broken. He picked up the phone, canceled the Serena Lane campaign. He ordered his marketing director, "But Ethan, this contract is worth, I don't care what it's worth. Cancel it and call the lawyers. We're suing the tabloids for defamation." The line went silent, then a hesitant, "Understood." Ethan dropped the phone, leaning back in his chair. His reflection stared at him from the darkened window, impeccably dressed, perfectly composed, yet crumbling inside. For years, his entire existence had been about preserving an image, the cold businessman, the untouchable mogul, the man whose life looked flawless on the covers of magazines. But what had that image ever given him, except isolation, except empty relationships built on appearances? Now, for the first time, he wanted something real, someone real, Claire. But wanting wasn't enough. He poured a drink but didn't touch it, staring at the glass like it held the answer. The question gnawed at him. Could he destroy the image he had spent his entire adult life protecting for the sake of one woman? Could he step out from behind the armor, not just for her, but for himself? The storm outside mirrored his turmoil. Lightning split the sky, rain battering the city. Ethan stood at the window, his pulse echoing with the thunder. He thought of Claire's words. Words are easy. She was right. If he wanted her back, if he wanted to be worthy of her, he couldn't just deny the rumors. He had to live differently, publicly, irreversibly. The decision crystallized inside him, sharp and terrifying. No more masks, no more carefully curated appearances. If the world wanted a story, he would give them one, but it wouldn't be the one they expected. The next morning, Ethan issued a personal statement not through his PR team, not polished by spin doctors, but written by his own hand. He admitted to the loneliness behind the empire, denounced the gossip industry that thrived on destroying lives, and declared his intention to end contracts that profited from image over substance. It was reckless, it was radical, and it was the first honest move he had made in years. Yet, even as the media frenzy exploded anew, Ethan knew the hardest part was still ahead. Convincing Claire that he wasn't playing a role anymore, that this time, the mask had truly fallen. The press conference was held in a grand ballroom downtown, the kind usually reserved for company earnings announcements or glittering charity galas. Rows of cameras lined the back wall, microphones clustered at the podium, reporters buzzing with anticipation. Ethan stood behind the curtain, his heart pounding louder than the noise of the crowd. For years, these rooms had been his battlefield. He had walked in with carefully rehearsed lines, crisp suits, and the armor of confidence. But today, he had no armor. Only truth. Mr. Caldwell. "We're live in 2 minutes," a nervous aide whispered. Ethan nodded, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled slightly. He wasn't afraid of the press he had faced tougher interrogations. What terrified him was what this moment represented: the death of an image he had spent half his life maintaining. The stage lights hit his eyes as he stepped forward. Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters shouted questions, but he raised a hand, commanding silence. "I know why you're here," he began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You want answers. You want the polished statement that smooths over scandals and restores the image you've come to expect." He paused, letting the murmurs ripple through the room. "But I'm not here to give you that today." Gasps and camera clicks filled the air. "For 15 years, I've lived behind a mask." Ethan continued, "I became the cold businessman, the untouchable mogul, because I thought that was the only way to survive. I let magazines and tabloids define me. I let image become more important than truth." His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "I'm done living a lie. This," he gestured to himself, "no teleprompter, no prepared notes. This is who I am, a man who made mistakes, a man who let fear dictate his life, but also a man who wants to do better." The room was silent now, the kind of silence that meant every word was landing. "Effective immediately," Ethan said, his jaw firm. "I am stepping back from the Caldwell Board of Directors. Not permanently, but long enough to dedicate myself to something beyond profit margins and quarterly reports." The reporters erupted, voices overlapping. Ethan raised his voice above them. "I am launching a foundation dedicated to education for underprivileged children in Chicago. My father built an empire. My mother was a teacher. Between them, I learned the value of both power and knowledge. Now, I want to honor her legacy, the one the world never saw, by making sure kids who come from nothing still have a chance at everything." His voice cracked slightly, the first unpolished sound in years. But it was real. "This isn't PR. This isn't damage control. This is my choice. If you want to write about me, write about that. Write about what matters." He stepped back from the podium, flashes exploding, voices calling his name. But for the first time in his career, Ethan didn't linger. He walked off the stage, heart hammering, but lighter than he had felt in years. Claire watched it all unfold from a small cafe across town. The television mounted on the wall above the counter played the live broadcast, customers pausing mid-sip of coffee to listen. She hadn't planned to watch. She had told herself she didn't care. And yet, here she was, frozen in place as Ethan Caldwell, the man she had accused of living behind a mask, tore that mask apart on national television. Her throat tightened as she listened to him speak about his mother, about education, about choosing truth over image. This wasn't the polished CEO she had met in the lobby weeks ago. This was someone else, someone raw, vulnerable, human. She wanted to believe him. She ached to believe him. But a voice inside her whispered caution. Words could move mountains. Yes, but hadn't she already told him words are easy? She sipped her coffee, trying to still the storm in her chest. Around her, strangers applauded the screen, impressed by the billionaire's unexpected humility. But Claire's hands trembled as she set her cup down. Because while the world saw a man reinventing himself, she saw something far more dangerous, the possibility of hope. And hope was the most fragile thing of all. That night, Ethan stood alone in his apartment, city lights sprawling beneath him. The conference had been replayed on every network, dissected by pundits, lauded by some, mocked by others. He didn't care. For once, the noise didn't matter. What mattered was whether Claire had seen it, whether she believed. His phone buzzed with messages from board members, politicians, even old friends he hadn't heard from in years, but not from Claire. And as the hours stretched on, the silence from her was the loudest sound in the room. Across the city, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her modest apartment. She replayed his words again and again. "I'm done living a lie. This is who I am." It sounded true, it felt true, but feelings were dangerous. She had built walls around her heart for a reason, and she wasn't ready to let them crumble just because a billionaire finally remembered how to bleed. Still, as sleep finally claimed her, one thought lingered like an ember refusing to die. What if he really meant it? The invitation came quietly, almost uncertainly, the way Ethan now approached most things with Claire. "Come with me," he had said over the phone. "Just for the weekend, no headlines, no boardrooms, just us." Claire hesitated, but something in his tone less command, more plea softened her resistance. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They left Chicago late on a Friday evening, Ethan driving for once instead of delegating it to a chauffeur. The city lights faded behind them, replaced by open highways lined with trees stripped bare by autumn. The air grew cooler as they neared the lake, the smell of water mixing with pine. They arrived in a small town on the edge of Lake Michigan just past midnight. It was the kind of place where diners never closed, where motels had neon signs buzzing against the dark, where life moved without the urgency of skyscrapers. Ethan had booked a modest cottage near the shore, nothing like the lavish resorts Claire expected. Its wooden porch creaked, and the furniture inside was worn but comfortable. For the first time, she saw him in a space that didn't scream wealth. "Not bad. Caldwell," she teased softly as she dropped her bag. "Ethan," he corrected, almost reflexively now. She smiled faintly, but said nothing more. The dawn came quietly, a pale glow brushing the horizon before the sun revealed itself. Claire awoke to the faint sound of waves and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. She found Ethan on the porch, 2 mugs in hand, his hair mussed, his sweater simple, his bare feet tucked against the railing. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, handing her a mug. They walked down to the beach, their footsteps crunching against the cold sand. The lake stretched endless before them, its surface rippling with the first blush of light. The air was sharp, filling their lungs with something cleaner than either of them had breathed in weeks. They sat side by side on a weathered log, sipping coffee in silence as the horizon burned from gray to gold. Claire wrapped her coat tighter, stealing a glance at him. He looked different here, stripped of the city, the suits, the ever-present tension, almost like a man rediscovering who he was meant to be. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she whispered. "Yes," Ethan said, but he wasn't looking at the sunrise. Her breath caught when she realized his eyes were fixed on her. He set his mug in the sand, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box. No fanfare, no orchestra, just the sound of the waves, the cry of distant gulls, and the rawness of the moment. "Claire," he said, his voice steady but carrying a tremor beneath it. "I've spent my whole life building things, companies, images, walls. None of it matters without you." He opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, a slender band with a modest diamond that caught the morning light. Not flashy, not designed for magazine covers, just honest. "I don't want a life where I keep pretending. I don't want a future filled with masks. I want this a sunrise, a quiet town, coffee with you in my hands. Will you marry me?" Claire's eyes blurred with tears before she could stop them. The simplicity of it, the absence of spectacle, cut deeper than any grand gesture ever could. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart racing, her mind reeling. "Ethan," her voice broke. "I don't doubt your feelings. I don't doubt this moment. But our worlds," he shook his head gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Our worlds are still too different," she whispered, finishing the thought. "I'd always feel like a guest in yours. You'd always feel caged in mine." Ethan took her hand, his palm warm against her cold fingers. "Then, let's build a new one." Her tears spilled over, streaking down her cheeks. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself fall fully into this, to say yes without hesitation. But fear was a stubborn shadow. She looked out at the horizon, the sun now breaking fully over the water, casting everything in gold. Somewhere inside her, hope and doubt warred, tangled together in a battle neither could yet win. Ethan didn't press. He simply held her hand, waiting, his patience a vow in itself. The waves lapped at the shore, the light spread across the sand, and the silence between them was filled not with finality, but with possibility. They walked back up the beach slowly, hand in hand. Claire hadn't given him an answer, not yet, but she hadn't walked away either, and for Ethan Caldwell, that was enough for now. Claire had never been good at sleepings when her mind was restless. That night in the cottage near Lake Michigan, she lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of the waves, her body curled beneath the quilt, her thoughts tumbling in a relentless loop. On the dresser, the velvet box rested unopened. Ethan hadn't pressed her after the beach. He had simply left it there, as if to say, "The choice is yours, not mine, not the world's, yours." But choice was the very thing that terrified her. Marriage to Ethan Caldwell didn't just mean saying yes to a man. It meant saying yes to a life one lived under constant scrutiny, where every gesture could be misinterpreted, every silence filled with speculation. Could she survive that? Or worse, could she survive losing herself inside it? She sat up in bed, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. In her old life, the one before Ethan, her choices had been small, manageable, what shift to take, what bill to pay first, which recipe stretched a paycheck furthest. Ordinary decisions, safe ones. Now, the decision in front of her felt monumental, a fork in the road with no return. Her mind whispered fears in the dark. You'll lose your freedom. You'll always be the outsider in his world. One day he'll tire of you, like he tired of all the others. You'll be left with nothing. The voices were persuasive, echoing the doubts she had carried since childhood, that love was a luxury for other people, not for her. But then, just as sharply, came other memories. The way Ethan had stumbled through chopping onions in her tiny kitchen, the way he had listened, really listened, when she talked about her father's job at the post office. The way he had stood in the rain, unguarded, saying, "I don't want the image. I want you." Those weren't the gestures of a man playing games. Those were the cracks in the armor, the glimpses of someone she hadn't believed existed until she saw him with her own eyes. Claire slipped quietly from the bed and padded to the porch. The night was deep, the lake shimmering silver under a nearly full moon. Ethan was there, sitting on the steps, elbows on his knees, his hair ruffled by the breeze. "You couldn't sleep either," she said softly. He turned, surprised, then gave a weary smile. "Didn't want to wake you." Claire sat beside him, pulling the quilt tighter. They sat in silence, the kind that pressed but didn't suffocate. Finally, she whispered, "I'm scared." Ethan's head lifted, his expression open, vulnerable. "Of me, of losing myself," she admitted. "Of giving everything up and finding out one day that it wasn't enough to keep you, that I wasn't enough." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dark water. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "Claire, I can't promise you forever. No one can. But I can promise you this. I don't want you to give yourself up. I don't want you to disappear into my world. I want us to build one that belongs to both of us. A place where you're not just enough, you're everything." His words sank deep, loosening something clenched inside her. She looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had once seemed untouchable, now sitting barefoot on a porch at midnight, stripped of every layer but truth. And in that moment, she realized the greatest risk wasn't saying yes. It was walking away. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they laced with his. "I don't know how this will work," she admitted. "I don't know how to live in your world, or how to let you into mine. But I do know I don't want to lose what we've started." "I don't want to lose you." Ethan's breath caught. His grip tightened around her hand, as if anchoring himself to the words he had been waiting to hear. "So," she whispered, her voice breaking, "yes, yes, I'll marry you." The night seemed to hold its breath. Ethan turned to her slowly, his eyes searching hers as if to make sure he hadn't imagined it. "Yes," he repeated, almost disbelieving. "Yes," she said again, firmer this time, a smile breaking through the tears. Relief crashed across his face, raw and unrestrained. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it felt like he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. The quilt slipped to the porch, forgotten, as he kissed her hair, her temple, her lips, not with desperation, but with reverence. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Claire laughed softly, shaky but free. "I must be crazy. Then we'll be crazy together," Ethan replied, his forehead resting against hers. Later, as they returned inside, Claire picked up the velvet box from the dresser. She opened it, the ring gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Simple, unpretentious, exactly right. Ethan slid it onto her finger, his hand still trembling. "It looks better on you than I ever imagined." Claire studied the ring, then looked at him. "It's not the ring that matters," she said softly. "It's what we build with it." He nodded, his eyes shining. "Then let's start building." For the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was stepping into his world. She felt like they were stepping into something new, together. And though fear still lingered at the edges, it no longer held her hostage. Because love, she realized, wasn't about guarantees. It was about choosing again and again, despite the risks. And tonight, she had chosen. The banners hung proudly outside the modest brick building, the Caldwell Foundation for Education. 1-year anniversary. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. Students, professors, and community members filled the hallways, their voices overlapping in a joyful hum. Young men and women carried folders stamped with the Foundation's Crest scholarship packets that would allow them to attend colleges they had once only dreamed of. Ethan stood at the back of the room, watching as Claire handed a packet to a young woman with trembling hands. The girl whispered thank you through tears, clutching the papers like treasure. Claire's smile was warm, uncalculated, the kind that reached her eyes and softened her entire face. Ethan felt the same tug in his chest he had felt the first time he saw her behind that office desk. Quick-witted and unimpressed by him. Except now. She wasn't a stranger. She was his partner in love, in life, in purpose. A year had changed many things. Ethan had stepped away from the boardroom for good, handing over daily operations to a trusted team of executives. There had been skepticism, backlash, even headlines declaring his career finished. But the Foundation silenced the noise. Its impact was real, measurable, undeniable, and Claire had been at the center of it all. She refused to be just a figurehead, diving into the work with the same determination she once used to balance grocery store schedules. She organized tutoring programs, built partnerships with local schools, and interviewed every scholarship candidate personally, watching her command a room full of educators and philanthropists. Ethan often marveled that the world had ever underestimated her, but he didn't, not anymore. Later that afternoon, after the last speech was given and the last handshake exchanged, Ethan and Claire slipped away from the crowd. They walked through the nearby college campus, the late spring air carrying the scent of lilacs and freshly cut grass. Students sprawled on blankets, laughing and studying under the shade of elm trees. Couples strolled between ivy-covered buildings, their laughter echoing against the brick walls. Ethan reached for Claire's hand. She laced her fingers with his, their steps naturally in sync. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "Miss what?" "The old life, the parties, the headlines, the perfect suits." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not for a second." He glanced at her, his expression serious now. "I thought that was living. Turns out, it was just surviving. This," he gestured to the campus, the students, the quiet, ordinary beauty of the afternoon. "This is life." Claire smiled, her eyes soft. "Ordinary life. The best kind," he said, squeezing her hand. They paused near a fountain where water spilled gently over stone. Claire sat on the edge, tilting her face to the sun. The ring on her finger caught the light, simple and unpretentious, just like the life they were building. "You know," she teased, "if someone had told me 2 years ago I'd be married to Ethan Caldwell, running a foundation with his name on it, I would have laughed them out of the room. Would you?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her. "Absolutely," she said, laughing. Then her expression softened. "But if someone had told me I'd find a love that made me feel seen, safe, and free all at once, maybe I'd have listened." Ethan's throat tightened. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling, as always, at the fact that she was here, that despite every fear, every obstacle, she had chosen him. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. Claire shook her head firmly. "No, Ethan, that's the point. It's not about deserving. It's about choosing, and I choose you, every day." He kissed her then, slow and steady, the kind of kiss that didn't demand or prove, but simply was. As the sun dipped lower, they continued walking. A group of scholarship students spotted them and waved enthusiastically. Claire waved back, her face lighting with pride. Ethan watched her, the way her joy radiated outward, touching everyone around her. For so long, he had believed legacy was measured in wealth, in empires built, in names carved into skyscrapers. Now, he understood. Legacy was laughter on a college lawn. It was hope shining in young eyes. It was walking hand in hand with the woman who had taught him how to be real. They stopped on a hill overlooking the campus, the lake glittering in the distance. The world stretched wide before them, full of uncertainties, challenges, and yet undeniable promise. Ethan wrapped his arm around Claire's shoulders. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if your coffee machine hadn't broken that day?" Ethan laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "Then I suppose I'd still be lost, wandering a world of appearances, and I never would have found you." Claire tilted her head up, smiling through her tears. "The best broken machine in history. The best." He agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. As the evening settled, they walked back toward the foundation's modest building, its lights glowing against the twilight, hand in hand. Two people who had once lived in worlds too different to reconcile now walked a single path, one they had built together. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, the truth was undeniable. True love was never about wealth or appearances. It was about the courage to be real and the grace of being loved, not for who the world demanded you be, but for who you truly were. Life has a way of surprising us in the most ordinary moments. For Ethan, it wasn't at a gala or on a magazine cover where he found what truly mattered. It was in a simple coffee shop, through the eyes of a woman who refused to be dazzled by wealth. His journey reminds us that love, honesty, and the courage to be ourselves are worth far more than status or possessions. Many of us, as we grow older, understand this truth more deeply. We realize that the things that once seemed urgent titles, appearances, approval fade quickly. What endures are the quiet joys a hand to hold, a laugh shared over dinner, the chance to leave behind something meaningful for the next generation. The story of Ethan and Claire is not just about romance. It's about rediscovering the beauty of an ordinary life and daring to build a legacy of authenticity. It asks us to reflect. Are we still hiding behind the masks the world expects of us? Or are we brave enough to live truthfully? Perhaps the most valuable lesson is this: love grows strongest not in perfection, but in honesty. And it's never too late to choose what truly matters. Thank you so much for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you more heartfelt stories about love, courage, and the beauty of everyday life.